Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us this morning for our April Title I webinar. Just going to work on getting our presentation pulled up here. My name is Erin Suddeth, and I'm the branch manager for the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch at KDE, and I have a colleague with me today.
Hi, I'm David Malonte, one of the assistant directors in the division.
Right, there we go. I've got our presentation pulled up. And I said this as people started coming in, but just as another reminder, as you're joining us, please be sure that you've got your camera turned off and your mic muted. This is just going to really allow all the participants to be able to focus on our presentation. As always, we do like to have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So you can, those of you joining us in Teams, you can put those in the chat if you'd like, or if you'd prefer to come off mute, you can just use the raise hand feature, put it in the chat, and we'll call on you. For those of you who are watching through the media portal, you can send any questions or comments to me at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov. And we do always post our webinars and the accompanying PowerPoints on our Title I Documents and Resources webpage. That should be up either later today or sometime tomorrow. We try to do that pretty quickly for you. So first up, we've got a recap from our March webinar. We really focused on parent and family engagement for the March webinar. We talked about parent and family engagement policies, specifically the school level policy. There's a district and a school level policy, and they're slightly different. We also focused on the school family compact, which is just a school level requirement. We talked about the different requirements for both of those, and we also just talked about some best practices. So be sure to check that out if you weren't able to join us. There was a lot of really useful information. You may also want to share that recording out with school level staff because we did focus a lot on school level documents. So at this point in the year, a lot of your schools are working on getting feedback from parents about those documents, starting to work on reviewing and revising them for next year. So if they're able to access that webinar, they can make sure that all the required information is included in those revisions. For today's webinar, we are talking all things carryover. We've got a new resource posted on our webpage. It's called the Title I Part A Carryover Information Document. And so what I want to do today is just really take a deep dive into that document. So we're going to be looking at just kind of some background information and some terms that you hear tossed around with carryover, the 15% carryover limitation, spending carryover funds, including any funds that are from required reservations. We'll talk about the carryover limitation waiver, as well as creating a process for monitoring carryover, which is a somewhat common finding that we have in our monitoring. So we're going to get started with just reviewing a few key concepts and terms. So when we're discussing the expenditure of funds, one of the terms that you're going to hear a lot is obligation, or you may hear someone say, when were the funds obligated? So what does that mean? Obligation refers to the point at which a party has entered into a binding commitment to pay out money. I do have a few examples from 34 CFR 76707 on the slide, but this regulation actually includes more. These are just a couple of the examples I pulled from that. So the first one, personal services provided by an employee of the state or the subgrantee. So all of you as districts are subgrantees. For this, obligation occurs when the services are performed, when the person actually does the work. If we're talking about services by a contractor who's not an employee of the state or the subgrantee, the obligation occurs on the date at which the state or subgrantee makes that binding written commitment to obtain those services. If we're talking about travel, obligation occurs when the travel is taken, and rental of real or personal property, obligation occurs when the state or subgrantee uses the property. Now, for those of you who attended our training with the Brewman Group, formerly Brewstein and Manasfit, back in September, you'll remember that they shared this information. And the chart outlining all the different obligation timelines is in the purple book that you received at that training. It is on page 83. So our next term is period of performance. You may also hear something like grant life, and those mean the same thing. So this refers to the total amount of time that funds from a federal grant are available for obligation. When we're talking about Title I Part A, the period of performance is 27 months long, and it's divided into two sections. So the first section of that period of performance or grant life is the initial grant period. That is 15 months long. It begins on July 1st of the federal fiscal year. I do want to point out that districts cannot draw down on those funds until your consolidated application has been approved in the Grant Management Application and Planning System, or GMAP. So that first 15 months, that's the initial grant period. Then we have something called the tidings period that is 12 months long, and this is granted automatically under the Tidings Amendment, and that is in section 421B1 of the General Education Provisions Act, or GEPA. It is also found in the Uniform Grant Guidance in 34 CFR 76.709. So up next, we have our carryover limitation. And for those of you who've been around for a while, this is going to sound familiar. So we know that Section 1127A of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, states that not more than 15% of Title I Part A funds allocated to a district for any fiscal year remain available for obligation for an additional fiscal year. So that means that districts need to ensure that at least 85% of their Title I Part A funds are obligated for activities that occur no later than September 30th of the following fiscal year, that initial 15-month grant period. As stated in ESSA 1127C, this limitation does not apply to districts that receive less than $50,000 in Title I Part A funds for the fiscal year. That's very few districts fall into that category. So the carryover limitation is unique to Title I Part A, and it does apply to the total Title I allocation, the district activities, parent and family engagement, private school, as well as any funds that may have been transferred into Title I Part A from other programs, such as Title II. So you might be wondering, why do we have this carryover limitation? When Congress appropriates funds for a program such as Title I Part A, the expectation is that these funds are needed to address current needs. The majority of the funds should be spent on the needs of the students who generated them. So saving the funds for a rainy day is really not in keeping with the intent of the program. Additionally, there can be consequences for not spending the funds timely. So if you've kind of just been holding on to those funds and then you're about to hit that deadline, you're trying to spend a large amount of carryover funds before the period of performance comes to an end, that could result in some expenditures that may not be very intentional or needs-based, because you're just trying to make sure that you get those funds completely spent. So we're going to use the current school year as an example and break down that period of performance. All right, so this is for the 22-23 school year. So on July 1st, 2022, that is when the initial grant period began. And once a district received their approved application, they could begin obligating funds. Then September 30th of 2023, so a little less than 6 months from now, that is when the initial grant period is going to end. That means that at least 85% of your total allocation should be obligated by that date. At this point, any remaining unobligated funds are going to become carryover funds. So on October 1st of 2023, that very next day, that is when the tidings period begins, that additional 12 months that everybody gets from the Tidings Amendment, and no more than 15% of the total allocation can be carried over. September 30th of 2024 is when the tidings period ends. At that point, 100% of the total allocation must be obligated. Any unobligated funds have to revert back to the US Treasury. Now, we really don't want to have to send funds back, so we highly recommend obligating spending all those funds. So as you will read in the informational document, there is flexibility in how most carryover funds are spent. The district can follow standard allocation procedures and maybe redistribute those funds to their schools, still following that rank order, or they may use the funds for a district level initiative, such as some professional development. Now, this flexibility does not include required reservations. So funds which are required to be reserved and spent on specific purposes retain their character and must be spent on their original designated purpose when carried over to the subsequent fiscal year. So we're going to look at some of these required reservations, and I've also got the ESSA citations noted next to each one. First up is parent and family engagement. We all know that districts receiving over $500,000 must reserve at least 1% for parent and family engagement. Now, if any of that required 1% is carried over to the next year, it has to be used on parent and family engagement. You can't spend it on something else. Up next is homeless. All districts are required to reserve a reasonable and necessary amount to provide services for homeless children. Now, there's not a set percentage or minimum or maximum amount here. This amount is determined at the discretion of the district, and that is in ESSA 1113 C3C. However, you do have to provide a methodology for how you determined your amount when you're working on your GMAP application. There's a narrative space on the district set aside page for the homeless set aside, and you need to tell us how you came to that amount as being reasonable and necessary. Did you look at previous year's spending? Did you conduct a needs assessment? Are you using some sort of per pupil allocation? Those are just some of the different options. And you can look at the help page in GMAP for some more information on that. So once that application has received approval, the amount that's been reserved for homeless cannot be decreased. So at some point when you've revised your allocation, maybe after your application, after final allocations came out, you may have gotten it returned from KDE saying you reduced the homeless set aside. You can't do that because those funds are going to need to be spent on homeless students. So the intention is that all of the funds are spent during the year in which they're generated. Now, in the event that there's a minimal amount of carryover, again, we have to still spend those funds on services for homeless children. So that's why it's really important to be really intentional when you're determining the amount to reserve for that set aside. Related to homeless, we've also got the McKinney-Vento set aside. This doesn't apply to a lot of districts because McKinney-Vento is a competitive grant. As part of that competitive grant application process, one of the things that the district does on their request for application or their RFA is agrees to reserve a specific amount of their Title I Part A funds in addition to the required homeless set-aside funds. This amount cannot be lowered, nor can it be split across the homeless and McKinney-Vento set-aside categories. This is an amount that you agreed on when you were working to apply for that grant. The last one on here is equitable services for participating private schools. So again, this won't apply to everyone. ESSA states that equitable services funds shall be obligated in the fiscal year for which the funds are received. So what that means is that there should not generally be any, definitely not any sort of significant amount of carryover. Now, the non-regulatory guidance, specifically question B27, does outline some scenarios which may result in small amounts of carryover and how the district should handle that. We also have an article which is going to touch on this coming out in our May newsletter, and that will be coming out on Monday, so be sure to look for that. Next is the carryover limitation waiver. ESSA 1127B allows KDE to waive the carryover limitation for a district once every 3 years if it determines that the district's request is reasonable and necessary.
Thank you.
Or the supplemental appropriations for this subpart become available. Now, districts receive notification and instructions on how to request this carryover waiver in the fall. We typically send those out mid to late August, and the window to request that waiver remains open until September 30th. We usually send that out a variety of ways. We put it in the Commissioner's Monday message, and we email it directly to our Title I coordinators to make sure that everybody is in the loop on that. We also have reminders in our August and September webinars. KDE maintains a list of the districts that have received a waiver, as well as when that district would be eligible to request another waiver, because as I said when we first got on this slide, this is supposed to only be once every 3 years. Now, we have had some waivers to the carryover limitation related to COVID-19. The U.S. Department of Education granted a waiver of that 15% carryover limitation to all states for the 2019-20 school year. Now, KDE requested and was granted waivers for 2 additional school years. So on this slide, I've listed all of the school years for which there was a waiver to the carryover limitation requirement. So 2019, 2020, that's Project 310F. That was the waiver that went out from USED to all states, all districts automatically. 2020-21 school year, Project 310G, that was one of the ones that KDE requested and was granted. And then the 21-22 school year, Project 310I, again, that is one that KDE requested. What these waivers did was they allowed KDE to grant a district's carryover request more than once in that 3-year period. Now, does this mean that all Kentucky districts automatically received a carryover limitation waiver for those years? No. Districts still had to officially request the waiver following KDE's established process, and we talked about that each of those years in our webinars and in our announcements that went out via email and the Monday message. So those of you who participated in those webinars, probably the August webinar of the past few years, will remember that with the approval of each of these COVID-19 related waivers, KDE advised districts that subsequent waivers may not be available, and the district should strive to meet the 15% carryover limitation on the current year's funds. So each time we got one of those kind of special waivers, we have no idea if there's going to be another one in the future. So we kind of encourage you, don't count on that, just operate as you normally would, assuming that there's not going to be any additional waivers. So in the absence of an additional waiver, the once every 3-year period limitation will resume. So the next slide has a table that's going to kind of outline that period for us. So assuming that we return to that traditional once every 3-year time period, this is when districts who've requested recent carryover waivers will be allowed to request another one. So I'll just kind of go through each of these for you. So if your district's most recent carryover waiver was requested for fiscal year 2020, talking about school year 1920, you would have sent this in August or September of 2020 for the Project 310F funds. You will be eligible for another carryover waiver for fiscal year 2023. That's this current school year. That's what you could be sending in this August or September. If your district's last carryover waiver request was fiscal year 2021, school year 2021, you would have sent that to KDE in August or September of 2021 for your Project 310G funds. Your next period of eligibility is going to be fiscal year 2024, so next year, school year 23-24, and you'll be sending that in August or September of 2024. And then finally, if your most recent carryover waiver was from fiscal year 2022, just last school year, you sent that in this past August or September of 2022 for Project 310I, you will be eligible for another carryover waiver in fiscal year 2025. That is school year 24-25. So you'll be sending that into KDE in August or September of 2025. So because of those additional waivers provided by the U.S. Department of Education that I mentioned on the previous slide, Your district may have received carryover waivers for all 3 of these years, or maybe the last 2 years. If your district received a carryover waiver for each year, the next time you'll be eligible to request another one will be September of 2025. Again, this is in the absence of any additional waivers from USAID. This will return to the typical timeline for this. So next is waiver ineligibility. KDE does not have the authority to grant a district an additional carryover waiver during the 3-year window. That's why those COVID-19 related waivers had to come from the US Department of Education. So in the event that a district with more than 15% carryover at the established deadline does not receive that carryover waiver because they're ineligible, maybe they selected one last year, that district will have their allocation reduced by the exact amount exceeding that 15% limitation, and the funds will be made available to other districts. This is per ESSA 1126C, and our next slide contains kind of an example breakdown of that. All right, so this scenario, we're talking about school year 21-22, that's state fiscal year 2022. So in this example, we have a district who's received a $1 million allocation for the 21-22 school year. And our example district is ineligible for a carryover waiver. So first, we're going to look at what should happen. That's going to be lines 1 through 3 of this table. So at first, we've got that initial grant period, that initial 15 months, starting July 1st of 2021, going through September 30th of 2022. The district should obligate at least 85% of that $1 million during this period. So $850,000 should have been obligated. Next, we've got the tidings period, the additional 12 months that started October 1st, 2022 and ends September 30th of 2023. So we are in the tidings period for that grant right now. So during this period, the district should have only carried over $150,000 maximum of that original $1 million allocation. So that's how it should have worked. Now let's look at what actually happened in our example scenario with lines 4 through 6. So what actually happened was during that initial grant period, the district obligated $700,000 of their allocation, so 70% of the total. That means they had 30% of the allocation that was unobligated at the end of the initial grant period. They had $300,000 that was left. That's $150,000 more than they were allowed to carry over according to the law. So now by law, KDE would have to reduce that district's allocation for the next year by $150,000. So this is why it's so important to monitor your spending throughout the year and make sure that you are on track to meet the carryover limitation. So let's talk about a process for monitoring carryover. I mentioned that this is something that has come up sometimes during our monitoring process. 2 CFR 200.303, which can be found on page 131 of your purple Edgar book. This requires non-federal entities, such as districts, establish and maintain effective internal control over the federal award. So the creation and implementation of written processes is an example of an effective internal control. So a couple things we want to highlight here. A policy alone is not sufficient. We are looking for a high-level view of the various functions necessary to accomplish a specific task and an outline of the specific steps that the district is required to take to receive a particular end result. So let me kind of break that down a little bit. We have talked about this a number of times in some of our previous webinars because words like policy, process, and procedure sometimes get used interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable when we're looking at these types of requirements for Title I. So a policy is like a statement. Your district probably has a policy that says we will not carry over more than 15% of the Title I Part A funds to the subsequent fiscal year. Now that policy does not explain how you'll do it. It just says we won't do it. That's where your written process comes in. Your written process describes what you need to do to accomplish that policy. So we need to check remaining balances. We need to communicate those balances with school principals and private school staff, those types of things. The procedures within that process is where you get really specific. So number one, the finance officer will check remaining balances at the beginning of each month. The amounts are then emailed to each principal. Schools should have X percentage of their allocation obligated by this date, et cetera. That type of stuff is what we would want to see in your process and your procedures. It's telling us what you're actually going to do to make sure that this happens. Monitoring the expenditure of funds and ensuring that you meet the carryover limitation, this is not something that you do once a year. This is an ongoing process that should be regularly revisited. A process to monitor carryover and the expenditure of funds is one of several processes that KDE reviews during monitoring. We also review some financial processes related to the allowability of cost and safeguarding assets purchased with federal funds. And we do have informational documents to help you create each of those on our Documents and Resources webpage. These are a few of the guiding questions that you may want to consider when you're developing one of these processes. These guiding questions are in that new carryover information document. These are just a few of them. I think there's about 11 or 12 questions on there. Let's kind of take a look at each of these. First up, who's responsible for monitoring the expenditure of program funds? For example, is it going to be the finance officer? How often are you going to check the remaining balances? Is it going to be done monthly or quarterly? How will updates on those balances be shared with the appropriate parties? Is the finance officer going to share them with the coordinator, and then the coordinator is going to share it out with principals and private schools? Or is the finance officer going to share it directly with the schools and the private schools? That type of thing. There's not a right or wrong way to do that. It's just, what are you going to do in your district? Our next guiding question is, how will the district keep track of the period of performance for each grant and ensure that the oldest funds are spent first? So there's a concept in the business world known as first in, first out, or I think it's FIFO or FIFO. And the simplest real world example of this is when you're at the grocery store and they're restocking food. They're always going to put the newest stock way in the back because the expiration date of what's already there is closer. So they want to have things in that order. We kind of treat these funds the same way. And finally, how will you ensure staff are familiar with the process? How are you going to ensure that it's being implemented with fidelity? If you have a really fantastic process, but nobody's familiar with it, it's not being implemented correctly, then it's not effective. It's not really doing its job. So are you going to provide a training on the process? Are you going to maybe review it at the beginning of each school year with, the principals, discuss it with the private school people during your consultation meeting? And again, there are additional guiding questions on the information document. All right, so we will check for any questions. I know I just kind of put a lot of information at you. I don't see any in the chat. Let me check email real quick. Okay, I don't see any yet, but while you may be thinking of any last minute questions, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of items that you've received from KDE over the past few days. So this morning, when I sent out this PowerPoint and webinar reminder, I also attached an email that was originally sent at the beginning of April, and that is regarding our upcoming state federal programs training opportunity in June. Just to kind of summarize, this training is being presented by the Brewman Group. I already mentioned them a few times during this webinar, and we are offering this at no cost to districts. We strongly encourage superintendents, finance officers, and federal program coordinators to attend. A link to the registration form was included in this morning's email. So many of you were able to join us for our September training opportunity, and we received a lot of feedback on how useful you found that experience, which was really great. So for this June training, we are going to touch on some of the same topics that were covered in September, but we're also going to be touching on new topics that have come up during monitoring. So don't think that just because you went to the September one, you don't need this one. I definitely recommend attending again. And for those of you who are new, that is where people received this purple Edgar book that outlines all of these uniform grant guidance items. We are working on securing ELA credit and finance officer training credit for that opportunity. We've already had a few people reach out and ask about that. Right. Yesterday, everybody who's listed as the Title I coordinator, in-person role manager, received an email from me that was entitled Assessing District's Needs Survey. And there was a link in that for feedback on ways that our division, the Division of School and Program Improvement, can provide support for you in programs, including Title I Part A and the other programs that are within our division, such as Title III, the Migrant Program, SBDM, and others. So please take a few moments and complete that survey to help us determine how we can best support your needs. That survey is going to close on May 15th. And finally, you also received an email from me yesterday with a link to the Title I admin usage survey. Now, I sent you several emails yesterday with links to surveys. They were different. So as you may remember, KDE purchased subscriptions to Title I admin, excuse me, for every school district across the state for the 22-23 school year. So as we start kind of exploring the possible renewal of that subscription, we're just seeking some feedback on the usefulness of Title I admin for our districts. That information that you provide, we're just using that to inform whether or not we extend that subscription. So please be honest, let us know how often you use Title I admin, what you like, what you don't like. That will all help inform our decision. So if you need me to resend links to either of those surveys, just let me know and I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so it looks like we did get a question come into the chat. Okay. When do we anticipate GMAP opening for the consolidated application for fiscal year 2024? I don't have a specific date at this point, unfortunately. Can you address pre-award expenditures since it is not likely to have an approved application on file on July 1? Okay, that's a great question. So I mentioned how the period of performance begins on July 1, but as you know, you can't start obligating and drawing down on your funds until you have that approved application. Maybe your application doesn't get approved until August 1. At that point, you can go back and pay for anything that took place as of July 1. Because, we can't always control when the application gets into GMAP and how long it takes to get approved. So you are able to go back to the beginning of that period of performance. That's a really great question. All right. As a reminder, got some upcoming webinar dates. Our next webinar is going to be Thursday, May 25th, of course, at 10 a.m. Eastern. I'm planning to focus on requirements and information related to children and youth experiencing homelessness, and we're going to have our homeless coordinators with us. So you may want to share that date and time with your district homeless liaison in case they want to attend or share the recording with them after. As a reminder, we do value your feedback as evidenced by the multiple surveys I sent you yesterday. We always want to learn more about what is helpful and what you would like to see more of in our webinars and our newsletters and things like that. You can, of course, send feedback directly to me or your consultant. We also have an anonymous webinar feedback survey. The link is always available in our newsletters, and you can go there at any time and just give us some feedback. All right, we got another question. Can we charge the expenses to the project, but ensure we don't request drawdown until all approvals have been received?
Essentially, yes, but the risk but there is risk in doing that if the particular item of cost is not approved in the application. In that case, it would have to be written off to another program or to general funds.
All right. I'll do a quick last check of email. Oh, we got a question that may I have a copy of the purple book? Well, I recommend signing up for that training in June, and we will get you your very own purple book. All right, I don't see any other questions anywhere. So thank you all for participating today, and we will see you in the May webinar. Thank you.